Welcome to XYPN Radio, where your host Alan Moore brings you into a community of fee-only financial planners who want to profitably and successfully serve Gen X and Gen Y clients. If you're ready to get the knowledge you need from leaders in your field, learn from forward-thinking advisors, and take action on your own goals, XYPN Radio is the show for you. Here's your host.
Hello, everyone, and welcome to this episode of XYPN Radio. I am your host, Alan Moore, and I'm so thankful that you have chosen to join me today. This episode features an interview with Jim Cullen, who's the president of Financial Planners Assistance Corp., which is a compliance firm that works with a lot of RIAs. And I know the thought of hearing an episode about compliance doesn't excite most folks, but I promise this one is worth it. Jim is really funny and is extremely knowledgeable about compliance for both RIAs and broker-dealers. And I learned a ton from having him on. You'll hear us talk through his career path and how folks that are interested in getting into compliance can, if that's something that's of interest to you. We also talk about the differences between compliance for broker-dealers and RIAs and what you can expect if you're making the shift over from the broker-dealer world and starting a fee-only firm. We then ended by talking about the different things you need to be aware of when it comes to compliance, especially as you're starting a firm, such as what books and records you need to be keeping. So I know you're going to learn a lot from this episode. Also, remember to join our VIP community at xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP. So a lot of the questions that I asked Jim in this episode came directly from questions that people were asking in the VIP group. So I highly encourage you to join so you can interact with us there and ask questions. Now, this month's episodes are brought to you by Financial Planners Assistance, providing compliance services to financial planners and other investment advisors since 1982. Financial Planners Assistance is a boutique consulting firm that provides the personalized compliance services firms are looking for. You can check them out at www.financialplannersassistance.com. So without further ado, here's my interview with Jim Cullen. Hey, Jim, welcome to the show.
Yeah, thanks for having me.
Yeah, this is going to be fun. We get so many questions around compliance that I'm really glad to actually have someone who can speak about compliance. Sometimes we'll make stuff up because it's something that I'm like, I think I heard one time that you could do this, but it'll be nice to actually get some of those real questions answered.
I'm sure they're a lot of fun.
So I guess just to get started, tell us a little bit about your career. How do you get into RIA compliance? Because there's no like degree programs out there that you can sit for or that you can take or anything like that. So how do you get into this field?
It was really just the result of, I guess, taking calculated career risks over time. When I was in college, my original intention was to be a federal employee, a nice bureaucratic person. Nothing in particular, but when I graduated college, I fell in love with a girl who had a kid from a previous relationship. So we got married right when I graduated. So I had one child, second child on the way, and I needed to line up a career path as soon as possible. So I applied with the federal government, actually got accepted, but there wasn't any positions open in my area down in Florida, St. Petersburg, Florida. So as a backup plan, I also applied at Franklin Templeton Investments, which is also located in St. Pete, Florida. At the time, I had absolutely no idea what Franklin Templeton was. I had no idea anything about investments. And I got hired on as like an entry-level college graduate position in their call center, taking phone calls from shareholders and financial advisors about Franklin Templeton customer service stuff, not like selling funds or anything. So I did that for a couple years. And the thing with the working at a place like that, you really can't just browse the internet, even if you're on your break. So it would look bad. So as a result, I was actually reading their policies and procedures. And Franklin Templeton, very complicated firm, offices all over the world. Their compliance manual, I think if you actually printed it up, would have been like 10,000 pages or something like that. So,
whoa!
Yeah, so I always had material to read, and it was all transfer agent stuff, Investment Company Act stuff. And as a result, I became a very good resource for everyone on the floor because strange situations would come up and I just happened to know what the answer was because I spent my time reading this stuff. So I got tired of being on the phone talking to clients, and I was thinking, what's a job where I never have to talk to the investing public again? And I didn't know the answer to that question yet. So I was always thinking how to get off the phone. So what I did like about compliance is that It's kind of keeping the ship afloat almost, like protecting some sales areas from themselves, making sure everything is compliant, nothing going wrong as much as you can. And it was more of a tongue-in-cheek thing with the financial advisor. I've never had any interest in any kind of sales, any kind of, I guess, helping people. Never really been an interest of mine. So compliance just seemed like a natural fit, and is really just through dumb luck that I was able to get into IA compliance.
Okay, makes sense. So it was more about being sure that the slickback salesman was doing things the right way, and they were actually helping people and not just using crappy sales tactics that weren't legal.
Yeah, and another thing that I really liked is that, so I was in the customer service arm. I also did operational stuff, and I don't know, just over time, you go in, you do the operational side, you come out. It really wasn't motivating for me or rewarding. And I like the compliance aspect because you focus on internal firm stuff, but you also do a lot of outward focusing on the industry and the regulation. So I found that every day I went into the office, I really didn't know what I was getting into. Especially at Raymond James, they put me to work on a whole bunch of different projects that is really a learning experience for me. And I love the challenges that I faced. To give you an idea, my first 3 months at Raymond James, I had to get my Series 7, my Series 24, and my Series 66. And before that, I had never been licensed. I only knew the mutual fund industry. I didn't know the advisor side of it at all. And on top of those 3 licenses, I also had to learn SQL, the database language.
Oh, gross.
Oh, I ended up loving it.
Only a compliance guy could like SQL.
Oh, it makes so much sense. Like, there's no emotion. It's just coding. And I think one of the reasons I got the job at Raymond James was that I could tell them what Microsoft Access did, even though I'd never used it. I knew it was a database program, and I guess I was one of the few candidates that could actually tell them that. So that's one of the reasons they went with me, even though I did not give them any kind of indication that I knew how to use it or anything. But I ended up learning that down the road too.
Fair enough.
Yeah.
So how do they train compliance folks at a company like Raymond James? Is it really just like, here's a project, good luck? I mean, is it pretty standardized training process?
I think it really depends on the candidate. So there were compliance people there that were more of the operational side. Like, they had a very narrow focus that they would handle. And then they had some compliance people that were kind of just thrown on projects as they came up, depending on what their skill set was. So probably one of my bigger projects I did was they had to analyze brokerage accounts versus investment advisory accounts to see if the trading level is appropriate. Mm-hmm. Previously, it would take them about 2 weeks to crunch the numbers, but I was able to write an SQL code where I had the analysis done in 3 minutes.
Whoa.
Yeah, and I think they're still using that today, but I don't know, it's just a lot of fun. Yeah, I like that kind of work. So I was at Raymond James for a while. That's where I really cut my teeth on the investment advisory side, and I ended up getting recruited to an RIA firm out of Manhattan. They were located, the operational side and compliance and trading was located in Providence, so that's how I ended up in Rhode Island. And that was a great experience as well. So it's a lot of on-the-job training.
Yeah, it's what it sounds like. I mean, is there a place? I mean, I mentioned there's no degree program, but is there a place for folks that say, hey, I love compliance, it's really interesting to me, for them to go become experts, or do they really just have to get a job in the field to learn it?
There is a certification that I want to say it's NRS puts on called the Investment Advisory Certified Compliance Professional Program. There's that. That's the only one I could think of. There's one for the BD side of compliance as well, but that's the one for the IA side. It's like, I don't know, it's like, I want to say it's 2 or 3 years long. You do different segments. Almost, I'm sure it's not as hard as the CFA or the CFP, but it's structured about the same.
Makes sense.
Yeah, by the time I was going to do that, I was already consulting, so it doesn't really make sense because at least what I was looking at is stuff that I knew already. So it'd be, if someone really wants to get in compliance, they could do it that way, or there's some great, I don't know about great, but there's books out there that you can read if you don't have the opportunity to do it in-house to learn.
Okay, makes sense. So you went to work for an RIA, kind of started seeing that side of the world. So how did you end up, owning your own compliance consulting firm?
So the RIA that I worked for had a consultant named Jeff Calvin, who had been running Financial Planners Assistance Corp since 1982. He originally launched it when the SEC guidance came out requiring financial planners to become licensed, because up till that point, they were not required to be licensed at all. And then the SEC issued guidance pretty much saying financial planning is also a covered activity of an advisory firm, and you have to be a registered investment advisor to provide it. Mm-hmm. So he was an attorney at, I want to say, Penn Mutual. And when the SEC issued this guidance, he left the corporate world, formed the RIA compliance consulting firm to help with this huge wave of financial planners suddenly having to be registered. So years down the road, he was the consultant for the firm I was working for, and I was there for about 5 years, and just over time, ended up building a pretty good relationship with him. Although a couple times I wanted to fire him, but it wasn't my decision, so he still stayed on, and I'm glad I didn't fire him.
That's the beauty of compliance. You never really want to keep them around.
Oh yeah. They're doing the job right for the most part if you want to fire them. They're really doing wrong. I guess there's no middle ground there, but. So one day, he was in our office. We had him come out every quarter to interview people, just talk about what's on our mind, make sure that we're doing anything. And offhand, he said that our firm should buy his consulting firm, because at the time he was 65. He'd been doing it for a little over 30 years now. And we kind of laughed it off. But it turns out that he'd actually been looking for an heir apparent for a couple of years and having a really hard time finding anybody. And I think that has a lot to do with compliance people generally aren't very entrepreneurial. They're more of the employee mindset in general. Not everyone falls into that. So they're not really like real compliance people that know compliance, that know the job. They're not really looking to take on consulting firms or anything like that. It's kind of a weird situation, but he had a hard time trying to find anyone that he didn't have to train in order to take over the firm. So we ended up talking it out, and it just so happened during that time I was in Milwaukee for a conference and ran into an Alan Moore there, and I got to bounce.
This is true.
Yeah, I got to bounce some ideas off of you about the firm, and yeah, we made an agreement and taken over the firm from him. He's still rattling about. He focuses more on the litigation side, on the record stuff, and I'm handling all the compliance side.
That's awesome. I remember having dinner and beers with you when you were in Milwaukee. I forgot that was right about the time that you were looking at making the buy, because we were talking through just how buyouts work, because obviously compliance firms don't sell all that often. So there's not a lot of history there to comparables to look at. So.
Oh, yeah. And yeah, it was actually funny timing, because once he mentioned that the firm should have bought his firm, is like picking away at my brain. I'm like, well, why don't I buy it? This sounds like a good idea. And I ended up sending him like a message that was like, I don't know, like those spies, like marking the mailbox, because of course I didn't want my employer to know that I was entertaining the idea of purchasing a firm. And yeah, I sent him out a message when I was boarding the plane from Milwaukee. So then the whole flight there, I was nervous because like, did he forward it to my employers? And then I land and he's like, yeah, let's talk. So it was a good time. And at that time, you were going to be my financial planner. But of course, things have changed.
Yep.
So now I'm just going to have to go to a insurance guy. He's going to
exactly.
I can't wait.
Whole life insurance policies are the way to go, especially for someone in your position.
Oh yeah, I'll buy it out of spite. That's what you get for not doing financial planning.
You know you're doing well in your career when you can buy a whole life insurance policy out of spite to the guy that can't be your financial planner. So that's awesome, and I think it's one of the fun things. I always like to ask these questions around people's career, because it's always fascinating to see where people come from. We think of Matt Becker wrote a really good article for the XYPN blog back when we first launched, probably back in May of 2014. and it was Mind the Gap, but it was talking about this, that you don't see everything that happens behind the scenes. You only really see this kind of end result. And so people can look at you and say like, oh, Jim owns a compliance consulting company and he's doing compliance. But it's like, but what it took to get there was, as you said, a lot of calculated risks, a lot of effort. I mean, you could have been sitting at Templeton, just like hanging out, answering the phone, but instead you were reading through 10,000 pages of compliance policies. And that's what it takes. And so I hope listeners understand that it is hard work, and it does take a lot of risk and a lot of effort and a lot of work and focus in order to kind of move along to where, you get to the piece in your career where you're really happy doing what you're doing. But it does not happen by accident.
Yeah, and a lot of failure too, because at Franklin Templeton, I don't know how many different jobs I applied for, like with AML, trade control. And the thing with there is like every position, everyone wanted out of the call center. So you'd have like 150 candidates to go against. Ooh. And it was really like demoralizing at some point. Like I was glad eventually I found a spot, because if I ended up in AML or trade control, I probably wouldn't have been nearly as happy. So yeah, like it's definitely successes and failures all add into it.
Yeah, it's funny when you go back and you can connect the dots and be like, thank goodness so-and-so didn't hire me, or thank goodness someone did hire me, or you made the decision when you did, and you don't realize the impact of it at the time. But I do hope that that's what, many of these interviews give our listeners, is just the courage just to take some risk and take a chance, because you just never know where it's going to lead, and be willing to send that email to say, hey, I might be interested in what you were talking about. Do you want to talk further? And because the worst thing he could have said is no, and that would have been okay.
Yeah. And by the time my employer found out, I had to give them, I wanted to give them as much heads up as possible, just because I was their sole dedicated compliance person. And I felt like it'd be a hard time to replace me because I'm awesome. But my wife was a worry ward and had me do only 1 month notice, which I wanted to give him like 3 months, because she's like, what if they kick you out before everything goes through and it all falls through? So when I ended up telling my employers, I got a call from the president, and he's like, congratulations, like we found out and what's going on, and that's a fantastic opportunity. Like, we don't blame you at all for what you're doing. Yeah, so it's great.
So
left on good terms.
That's huge. And I think a lot of that comes from the maturity of the firm owner that you were working at, as well as you kind of matching that up and just showing, you were awesome. I know you're saying that tongue in cheek, but they obviously thought so, that to allow, to be happy about the transition. But are you still working with that old firm? Like, did you keep that consulting contract that is it Jeff that originally had, or?
Yeah. So I kept it for 1 year. That was to help train my replacement, get them on board. But when they wanted to renew, I was like, okay, we can renew. And I had to recognize that being a compliance person was that they're essentially paying me to critique my own cooking. Because at that point, like the compliance program, it was me. So like, am I going to come in every quarter and like, yeah, I did a great job. Like, we don't have to do this. So we did a year, and then we were discussing, I'm like, I really think you guys need like a new set of eyes. And of course they agreed. And their firm was getting, they got a couple more new business lines out. So
got a little more
that's
complicated.
Where we stand now. Like, we're still in communication, and they reach out to me for various things. And I reach out to them too, because they're a great resource if I need referrals to different professionals and stuff like that.
Makes sense. Well, so we're going to switch gears a little bit and kind of jump into just common questions and just, I guess, some general education around compliance. And so I guess to start off, I get a lot of questions from folks that are looking to join XYPN, that are looking to go fee-only RIA, and they've been working for a broker-dealer, or they've been working with a hybrid RIA, so they've got that broker-dealer connection, which is obviously a whole different set of rules, but I'm not sure people really understand it. So can you kind of summarize, and I know there's a million things we could talk about here, but could you summarize, when you're talking to someone that is in the broker-dealer world that's looking to transition to RIA, to kind of what they can be prepared for, what they can expect to change as they're making that transition?
Certainly. And I guess I have a pretty good view of it, because when I worked at Raymond James, I was also doing FINRA compliance, although a limited amount of it. I wasn't deep into the compliance, the BD compliance side, but it definitely had overlap because Raymond James was a dual registrant. So I guess the big thing is, of course, broker-dealers, they have the self-regulatory organization FINRA. And then the IAs, you're either going to be regulated by the Securities and Exchange Commission or by the state security regulator. The big difference between these would be that FINRA, the rules are more micromanagement rules based, where you can get a clear answer for most things. Their guidance is very clear, but very lengthy. They have a ton of rules. The SEC, on the other hand, the Investment Advisor Act came out in 1940, and it has been changed over the years, but not a whole lot, and it's largely principles based. So compliance on the IA side, I like to say it's more common sense. The downside to it, I guess, for firms is that since it's principles based, there's a lot of interpretation, a lot of gray area, and a lot of guidance, no action letters and stuff like that you'd have to research in order to get a clear answer. But I feel that it makes the regulatory environment makes it a lot more flexible for firms to develop and try new things as long as they stick to these common core principles.
Makes sense.
And as a result, my clients that come over from the BD side, I tell them that honestly, compliance is going to feel a lot easier to them than when they're with the BD side, because on the BD side, they have all the sales practice compliance stuff. They have all that stuff, different products, different level comp, different business lines. They may have to pitch CDs or who knows what their firm's having them do. Whereas on the IA side, their business structure is a lot simpler. And as long as they approach it with do the best for your client, for the most part, they're going to be fine.
So to summarize that, because it actually surprises me sometimes that I will get calls from folks that say, like, I didn't even know fee only was a thing. And they've been an advisor for 10 or 12, 15 years and don't even realize the difference in terms of regulatory structures. So maybe let me throw a couple things out and you correct me whenever I say something that's wrong. So we have two regulatory organizations. We basically have the SEC and we have FINRA. If you are a smaller firm, so under 100 million in assets under management, the state will regulate you. But ultimately, the SEC oversees the giving of advice or the selling of advice, and FINRA oversees the sale of financial products. And so each of them have their own kind of core structure and their rules around those actions. And so that's where, we'll say you're coming from the broker dealer side, which is, the sale of financial products. FINRA has their set of rules there. You have folks that are doing financial planning. They're giving advice. There's no product sales. They're regulated by the SEC or their state regulator if they're under 100 million AUM. Or we have these hybrid advisors that give advice and sell products, dual registered hybrid. There's a couple different names for them. They actually have to answer to both sets of rules and regulations. Is that all correct?
Yeah, with a couple small things. So the 100 million for SEC registration is largely true. If you're AUM based, there's like a list of exceptions that you can get around that. And there's some states where it's either $0 like Wyoming or 30 million like New York. And to break it down, I guess even simpler, how I view the difference between the two types of firms, BDs and RIAs, is who's paying you. So on the RIA side, the client's cutting you a check for financial planning, or they're having their fee deducted from their investment account. They're paying you directly. On the BD side, the financial advisor sells an American fund, and there's a commission. Well, the commission's coming from American funds. The commission isn't coming from the client. So it's more of a direct-to-consumer, I guess, relationship on the IA side, although there are complicated IAs where it gets very fuzzy, but the basis is really who's paying you.
Okay. No, that's a really good way to put that. I haven't heard that before. So on the broker-dealer side, so for folks that are coming over from there, one thing that I find is that the rules that people tell me, and I'll admit I've never sold financial products, so I've never been on the broker-dealer side. I've always been fee-only. But there seem to be a lot of conflicts in terms of the rules that people talk about. And I think where that comes from is that there seem to be two sets of rules. One is what FINRA says you have to do. And like I said, these rules based, all of these, different pieces that are pretty clear. And then you have what the actual firm that you work for will allow you to do. Do you find that firms are more restrictive than FINRA I guess, necessarily allows on things like social media or content marketing with blogging or things like that?
Oh, yeah. And it largely has to do with capacity, especially in the social media. They only have so many compliance advisors that can review content. And if you're thinking of like a BD where there's, I don't know, 5,000 financial advisors, if all of them were doing social media, there's no way that they could really proactively or reactively monitor all that. So on the FINRA side, there's clear FINRA rules, and then there's some catch-alls that it's up to your firm policy. So your firm can make a policy, and if you violate that, you're technically violating the FINRA rule because the FINRA rule says you have to follow your firm.
Oh, interesting. So,
Yeah.
so it's not just that, okay, well, the firm said I couldn't do this, so I did it anyway. It's like that makes it so you could lose your license for violating a firm level rule.
Yeah, in theory. So like one example would be the 407 rule. I forget what, I want to say it's like, no, not 1035. They updated the rules when the New York Stock Exchange and FINRA went together. But basically it says that you have to notify your firm if you're opening up an outside brokerage account for yourself. So that's the rule. You can notify your firm, but your firm can deny it and put you in violation of that rule if they really wanted to. I don't know in practicality if it's a big deal, but that's an example of one of the rules where there's the rule, but then the firm, what they determine is the overriding rule on it.
Okay. Wow. And this is why I think people get really frustrated on the broker-dealer side. I mean, I remember Jeff Rose, who I think is actually the one that introduced me to you back in 2012 initially via Twitter when I was looking at launching my firm. But he had said on his episode that we did earlier this year, he said that, he basically couldn't get a blog post through his compliance because it said, I love Roth IRAs. And he was working for LPL. And he said that he had been dealing with the compliance and the frustrations of like, you can say this, you can't say this. And the I love Roth IRAs tripped something and they wouldn't allow him to say it. And he said that's ultimately when he was done. And he wasn't unhappy with LPL. He wasn't unhappy with the services that he was getting there or anything like that. But ultimately, they were handcuffing him so much on the marketing side, particularly, because I don't think anybody's going to argue on, well, I want to use dishonest sales tactics, right? I mean, I think most good advisors are happy to follow the rules associated with that kind of stuff. But when it comes to marketing specifically, it's hard to do marketing whenever your broker dealer has, basically has the handcuffs on you around blogging and podcasting and doing videos or even just basic, building a PowerPoint presentation. You've got to get it approved. Oh,
yeah. And I guess to make it a little balanced, at Raymond James, I did on occasion get to review prospective advertising that FAs wanted to put out. Mm-hmm. And I can't say everyone's very smart and everyone's great at advertising and what they can and can't say. So it's like, I guess with any kind of business, you'll have the Jeff Roses where they're great. They have a good message and they're just kind of getting chewed up in the system. But then you have like the paste eaters that you have to like give them dull scissors all the time because they're going to hurt themselves. Like there's no middle ground. That's
funny.
Yeah, it's two groups. But Jeff, he's still a client of mine. And when I met him, he was telling me about LPL and he's like, oh yeah, I do some social media. And at the time I was thinking, okay, like one blog a month. Like, what's it look like? And he's like, oh, I did like 700 last year, which comes out to like 2 blogs a day. And like, I'd never heard of anyone in the financial industry doing that kind of volume before. And that was, I believe, through the LPL machine. So they were slowing him down and he was still putting out a lot.
That's funny. Yeah, he was a machine when he first started. He has since switched to longer blog posts, more guide-based, 10 times the length of the short posts he used to do. But yeah, I can imagine the frustration his compliance folks probably had with reviewing his 700 plus blog posts in a year.
Yeah, I'm sure he had his own dedicated compliance person.
Well, and I do understand it. I mean, obviously Kitsis and I talk about it a lot on this podcast, and it's something that everyone's sort of pushing out is the fact that you've got to be online. You've got to be findable online. And, we push niche markets and creating content for that niche market. And it's hard to do that if you can't blog or podcast or do videos or periscopes or all of these different pieces, and I don't know. I don't know how long it's going to take for compliance on the SEC side as well. Don't get me wrong. On the fee only side, we still have a lot of, I think, rules and regulations from the Investors Act of 1940 that are handcuffing us as well. But how long it's going to take them to catch up. And I'm afraid by the time the rules catch up with us, we'll be on to something else, because I'd love to be in the meeting with compliance folks around Periscope, which is, they disappear after 24 hours. Like, what do you do with that?
Right, right. And on the IA side, the social media guidance is very general, and I think it's sufficient, even though a lot of people really dislike the no testimonial rule. That's always a rub. But what I'm finding from my IA clients is that it's really the new, younger firms that are really using social media effectively. The larger firms, my clients, they have their own way of prospecting that's been successful for the last 20 years. They're also much bigger, so they feel like they have a lot more liability on advertising, and they're a lot more under the scope of the regulators. So a lot of them have been really, I don't know about scared, but they don't really see the risk reward on the social media advertising like the younger firms do. So as far as social media content out there, it's definitely at this point the smaller firms that are winning the race on that one.
Yeah, I totally agree. And I was in that boat because I remember when I first launched my firm, I got an email from somebody who said, you can't have a Facebook page for your company, right? Like, compliance doesn't allow that. I was like, what? Like, I would love to get into an argument with a regulator and answer a question as to why I have a Facebook page for my company. Because if that's banned, I mean, that just crosses the line of absurd. But I also assumed that as a small RIA with, a couple million under management, if they were coming after someone to make an example of them for having a Facebook page inappropriately, I probably wouldn't be the one they came after.
Yeah, and the regulators haven't said this, but I get the impression, just because if I was in their position, I would have the same viewpoint, that overall social media is a net positive for the regulated entities, because the fly-by-night firms, the ones that are running Ponzi schemes, all of them, they operate much better in the dark. They don't like to have all this advertising. They definitely don't want to have two-way media where people can review them and post stuff about them and share stuff about them. So it's almost like there's a certain level of transparency, and a new investor can, in theory, go online and get a fairly good sense about a firm and its legitimacy just by going through its profiles and seeing what people say on independent third-party sites, not on the firm's website itself.
That's a really good point, that it really is, social media is, and just online marketing in general, is allowing us to see inside of firms in ways that we never could before and evaluate advisors. And we use it as a way of saying, hey, this is our target market. Let's create content for them. But I mean, my feeling, and I had the opportunity to work with a couple state regulators where I was registered, as well as with some of the regulators via members of the XYPN network, and just having conversations with regulators about some of the new stuff we're doing, like monthly subscriptions, which many regulators hadn't seen before. But I mean, I get the feeling that ultimately regulators are there to be sure we're not stealing our clients' money. Like, in the end, that's their job, is to be sure we're not stealing our clients' investment money. So if you're not, then you're probably okay. And there's obviously some things you got to do, and rules you have to follow, and records you got to keep, and all that sort of thing. But ultimately, like, that's really their job. They're not there to shut you down. They're there to protect the client.
Oh, yeah. And that was probably one of the biggest shocks to me coming into consulting. So at Raymond James, SEC, FINRA, any of the exams, stuff like that, it was just brutal, because it's a large firm, has a history, although it was a great firm. I really enjoyed my time at Raymond James, but they just come in knowing something's wrong and they're looking for it. Not very friendly. When I moved to the RIA, we weren't audited while I was there, but there was always that hanging cloud of the SEC is going to come in, they're going to find something, and we're going to be not slaughtered, but really penalized, even though we ran a very clean shop. But there's always that thing in the back of your head, like, what am I missing? What are they going to find? So then on the consulting side, like right now, I think I have about 15 SEC audits going on, and then I don't even know how many state audits. But sometimes we get the deficiency letter, and I could have sworn that they were going to get an enforcement action or something bad was going to happen. And it was like a slap on the wrist, but it was not really slap on the wrist, is a deficiency letter. They found some stuff. It wasn't to the level where they needed an enforcement action, but it's like, you need to fix this. And they're like, okay, let's fix it. So I was surprised by how willing they're a lot of the regulators are to get you compliant. And on the state side, I really like the fact that many states will come out in the first year or two so that you don't get into any bad habits. Like, you'll have a relationship with your regulator from day one pretty much, and they can fix anything that is going to be a problem so that you don't get into a routine of doing this thing and you have to go back 10 years to fix it.
It's a good point. When I launched my firm, I was joking that I swear the state of Wisconsin regulators did not read any of my documents. I know they did because they sent me a note about one of my investment management agreements, but they just said, we'll see you in 6 months. And they did come in 6 months later, and it was just enough time for me to have a few clients, for me to be, operating, keeping records, things like that, so they could say, hey, this is how you want to be doing it, and these are some things you don't want to do, and that sort of thing. So it was actually really helpful to kind of get things started off right. I don't know if all states do that or if that was just a Wisconsin thing, but they said they always go in 6 months after launch, and then they came in every 3 years. So, they would have been coming in here recently had I not sold Serenity Financial.
Yeah. And I guess a little bit more of an industry view. The SEC is always playing catch up about auditing firms. They try to shoot for a pretty low number, although staff wise, it's a really big number because there's a lot of registered SEC firms, especially now that the hedge fund guys and girls are being registered. But the big difference, and if it was possible, like from a budget standpoint, to give you an example, a lot of states, the registration process will take 1 to 3 months. I had a client register in Tennessee that took 9 months for some reason, but I think Tennessee at the time was short on staff. But to apply at a firm, they go through everything, your ADVs, your advisory agreements, and this is generally every state. They double check registrations. They go through, like Ohio goes through compliance manuals. Utah goes through business continuity plans. Like, it's a very thorough examination before they approve you so that when you get approved, you're starting off on the right foot. So to contrast, I registered a private equity firm with the SEC, and not counting drafting their ADV, which didn't take long, the registration process took 1 day. Like, I submitted to...
Wow.
Yeah, and they're managing a lot of money. I submitted to the SEC, got an approval the next day. All they look at, if they look at anything, which I'm not sure if they do or not, is the ADV filing. So no advisory agreements, no compliance manuals, nothing like that. If the SEC took a more active approach during the registration process, I think it'd be better for the industry. Although for me as a consultant, it'll make my job harder, but I'm willing to sacrifice that because I have some clients that get registered with the SEC and it could be 10 to 15 years before they ever meet anyone from the SEC or hear from them.
Wow.
And by then, who knows what you're doing at that firm that's wrong.
Yeah, and I think that's something that, there's a lot going on, obviously, with the Department of Labor and fiduciary rules and all this, and the kind of FINRA pushing maybe to be able to regulate RIAs. And there's just a ton going on right now. And that's definitely something that we hear is, hey, SEC's not going in often enough. And so, but the states seem to have stepped up and are doing a lot of pieces there. So for folks that are getting started, that are looking at starting a firm, my joke has always been in the IA world, never make any guarantees and don't tweet when you're drunk. And if you can follow those two rules, you'll be mostly compliant. But what are the nuances beyond that? I mean, obviously, client testimonials have been a thing. You can speak to that, as well as just what else should, new advisors that are starting a firm that have never had to do compliance before, they just have been following the rules they've been given. What should they be looking out for to stay compliant?
Probably the big thing would be to make sure that they're keeping adequate books and records. That's often a deficiency for new firms. So if you have a client sign on, keep a copy of the signed agreement. It could be stored electronically or you can keep the physical copy. It doesn't matter. But a lot of firms' deficiencies, bringing on a new client, it falls through the cracks. And when the regulator comes in, turns out they don't have a signed agreement, which a lot of times the regulator is like, okay, we'll just have them sign it when they come in, or you have 30 days to have them sign it. If you're a repeat offender, the regulators may say, well, guess what? The fees you charged them for the last 7 months, you have to rebate them because you didn't have an executed agreement.
Whoa.
So it is, that's the worst case scenario that I can imagine on that. But really books and records. So every client file should have advisory agreement executed, some kind of document showing that you actually care about the client's financial situation when you're advising them. So it could be suitability questionnaire, investment policy statement, financial planning document outlining their situation. Keeping any correspondence. If a client actually sends you a letter, you have to keep the original letter for 5 years after the client terminates, which a lot of clients don't do that anymore, but keep that in mind. Archiving your email correspondence, do that. If you're doing investment management, making sure that you could run a trade blotter report if the client or if the regulators ask for it. It's really just keeping clean records and making sure you have everything that the regulator's going to ask for.
Gotcha. So can investment advisors call their regulator and get a list of, hey, these are the things that, we're going to be wanting you to keep records of? Because I'm assuming state to state can be different.
The majority of the states base their books and records requirement off of the SEC guidance. The only difference that I usually see is either the state says you have to keep your personal brokerage account statements as part of your books and records, or they don't mention it. So you can go off of the SEC rule. Each state, they're going to have in their statutes the list of books and records, although a lot of the language is from 1940, some terms that we don't even use anymore are commonplace.
Right.
So another good option, and what I usually send to clients, is the document request list that the regulators send out for an audit. So like state of Illinois has a one-pager of the 10 records they're going to want to review, which is essentially your books and records. So you could always contact a regulator, ask them for a list. A lot of states are kind of proactive when you get registered. They give you like a manual about what they expect when you're an RIA. That'll have the list in there. And then if you have any friendly firms that have been audited by your state, you can ask them for their document request list, and they'll give you a very good idea of what you need prepared.
Okay. So that's on the books and records side. What else do you see in terms of deficiency and just things that are going on?
Luckily, a lot of the deficiencies are just like kind of nitpicky administrative stuff. So I'm trying to think of some ridiculous ones, but I'm having a hard time thinking of it on the spot. But probably another deficiency is having someone at your firm that is essentially acting as an IAR, but they're not registered. That comes up because each state has their own definition of IAR. So a lot of them don't really change state by state, but you may have someone, if you have an employee at your firm that is compensated based off of assets that are brought in or services they're doing, they could be considered an IAR. And in that case, the state would just tell you to register them as an IAR, assuming that they meet the examination qualifications.
Yeah, I actually went through that myself because when I was in South Dakota, I sat in on all the client meetings, but really didn't touch the investments. And so they told us I didn't need to be registered. And when I moved to Wisconsin to work for another firm, they said, if he's in the meeting, he has to be registered. So my first 15 days or whatever, I couldn't actually be at any of the client meetings because I had to go, take the Series 65.
That must have been awful.
Yeah, that really put a damper on the first couple of weeks.
Yeah.
So in terms of client testimonials, this is another one that seems to be changing in third-party advertising or third-party review sites like Yelp and things like that. Can you speak a little bit to, I guess, one, can you ever use client testimonials? I mean, is there ever a way to do that appropriately and legally? And then what are some of the rules around, clients reviewing us on Yelp or Google Places or Facebook or giving us a thumbs up on Facebook saying how awesome of a financial planner they have? Any recommendations or thoughts on that?
So the big dividing line, and this is based off of SEC guidance issued in March of, I want to say 2014, maybe 2015, but I want to say 2014. And a lot of states, they're either silent on social media or they just go with what the SEC says. I can't think of any state that has anything different from what the SEC is putting out there. So I'll just go by SEC rules. So the big, I guess, to frame the conversation, there's two types of social media sites. The first type is your firm's social media site. So if you have a firm Facebook page, firm Twitter account, firm whatever that you use for advertising, which it's definitely going to be considered advertising by the regulators because advertising is anything that goes to more than one person with the intent of either gaining advisory business or keeping existing advisory business. And it would be a very hard argument to say all your social media activity, you don't care about gaining or keeping an advisory business.
Absolutely.
So it's considered advertising. So as such, the non-testimonial requirements there, the other advertising requirements for the IA side need to be in compliant on your firm's social media accounts. The other side of it is independent third-party sites. So this would be like Yelp, Google+, even Amazon. If you write a book and
good point.
People are, because I do have clients that write investment books and they're on Amazon and then there's reviews. So in order for it to be a third-party site is that it can't have a material relationship with your firm. So advertising dollars, it's really a smell test on that, because some sites you give them, I don't know, $10 or whatever so that you can update stuff. I don't know what. The Yelp thing might be a little bit different. There hasn't been any clear guidance since the Yelp's practices are questionable sometimes, depending on who you're talking to. So there can't be a material relationship between the site and your firm. You can't create content for the site. So if it's like a Yelp page, of course, like business hours, stuff like that you can do, but you can't have like, why are we different biography on the site.
Oh, that's really interesting.
Yeah, so it has to keep its independent third-party site. So when it's that way, people are going to be reviewing you, and you can direct people to look at you on Yelp, look at you on Amazon, as long as the prospective client or client is able to go to the site and they can look at whatever reviews they want. They can sort, they can do that. You're not cherry-picking reviews. So I do have clients that say, check us out on Amazon for our latest book or whatever. Then there's like 100 reviews and, I don't know, 4 stars or whatever. So you can direct them to sites as long as they're considered independent third-party sites.
So basically it's, whenever you're setting up your firm profile, kind of keep it basic. Don't do a lot of bio and stuff like that. And you can direct folks, but is it also correct that as long as you can't influence the rankings, like you can't have you can't go through and try to get all the negative ones deleted.
Right.
And then I believe I was told, and correct me here, is that you can ask clients to go give you a review on Yelp as long as you ask every single client in the exact same way. You can't cherry pick only your good clients and drop the ones that aren't happy with you, or is that just a no-go and just stay away from it?
I think you can do it as long as you're not like influencing them with like a gift card or whatever if they do a review. As long as it's like reasonable, like feel free to check us out on Yelp. I had a client that one of their consultants that used to work with them or was a former employee or something wanted to give a positive review on Yelp. I was like, no, because like it's obviously there's a material issue there.
That makes sense.
Yeah. So clients can go, they can rank you. And of course, it's a double-edged sword because you will get the random crazy person that you never worked with, like ranting about aliens or something on your Yelp site, giving you a 1-star review. So there's always that side of it. Okay.
No, that makes sense. So that's third-party reviews, and then testimonials pretty much out. Like, don't ever use client testimonials. Is that kind of the general rule of thumb?
Yeah, there is a workaround called the representative client list where you can create a 1-page document or however many pages giving a sample of your clients. And there's language on the bottom saying that this does not mean that they approve of our services, blah, blah, blah. But that really comes up for institutional money managers that are doing like pension plans. They can list the pension plans on there because I don't think anyone's going to care if John and Jane Doe are your client on the list. And you can't have like a blurb from them talking about their services. It's really just a list of the client and then this disclosure saying that this isn't really a testimonial, it's a representative client list. Oh, but that's really more on the institutional side.
Yeah, I could see saying like we have clients that work for Coca-Cola if you're in Atlanta because you want other Coca-Cola employees to become clients, but you couldn't have a client saying, oh yeah, he's the best, financial advisor, knows everything about the Coca-Cola pension plan or anything like that.
Yeah, and then you also need to get client approval for using them, and you also may have to end up updating your privacy policy saying that you'll use them for marketing purposes.
Right, which clients would love, obviously.
Oh, yeah.
So we're talking basically about all the things you can't do. But for anybody that's been, especially on the broker-dealer side of the house, or has worked for a larger RIA that has a lot of restrictions, that's pretty much it. I mean, like, those are the big ones that I hear. And obviously that you're saying that you're hearing about is don't do any client testimonials. We joke, no guarantees. Don't ever guarantee investment returns. Don't guarantee financial peace of mind or anything else. Like, just don't ever use that word. Keep things where they need to be. I don't know. Keep their books and records. Like, it's actually not that complicated. I feel like I don't know. Sometimes I hear from folks that are looking to break away and the broker dealer will say something like, oh yeah, compliance is so hard. Like, it's so complicated. You're going to get sued. Like, you need to use a broker dealer for us to do your compliance. It's almost like a scare tactic, but it's not nearly as scary as maybe they're making it sound.
Oh yeah, definitely. And also it may not be a legitimate scare tactic. Like, they may really feel that way just because they're not used to the RIA side. So they assume compliance is like that all over the board. So there's that. But yeah, the compliance side's a lot easier. There's a couple other advertising rules. There's the catch-all fraud rule. Like, you can't be deceiving, fraudulent, anything like that in your advertising. There's also, if you're going to advertise investment performance, and there's a whole slew of disclosures you need to add to that. Then the last one is really not offering a free service that really isn't free. Sometimes that comes up.
Oh, that's a good point. That, I guess, that was obviously a bait and switch, but I could probably see how people could trip over that accidentally by trying to use it as marketing, but ultimately it's deceptive advertising.
Yeah.
All right. And speaking to the investment performance, I just always tell advisors, just don't even bother. Just that is an extremely complex process in order to report on investment returns compliantly. So it's just not even worth it. And especially in our world of financial planning, you really, I don't think you should really be promoting investment returns anyway. That's not really the point. So,
yeah. And the RIA firm that I worked at before, they were SMA managers. So they were on the big wrap wirehouses, platforms. Like, they definitely sold performance, and they had to get in compliance with GIPS in order to stay on some of these platforms. They just hadn't been GIPS compliant. So we had to go through 10 years worth of performance history, and it was a huge project. And it was like, I've learned since then that the only person more hated than compliance in this industry is a GIPS consultant. Like, oh man, like, even I like him personally, but man, that was a tough road. Very thorough. Ended up taking a lot of worry off my plate as far as performance numbers, but that was a very painful process, and no one likes GIPS consultants.
I guess, what is GIPS for any of our listeners that don't know?
It's the Global Investment Performance Standard. So it's run by the CFA Institute, and it's a way to have everyone calculate performance in the same way so that the investing public can compare people or firms against each other. Because before that, like, the firm may manage $5 billion. They have a composite for their strategy, their equity strategy. But if you read through the disclosures, really, there's only 20 accounts in that equity strategy. So how representative is that really of the strategy itself? And is that what an investor's going to expect? So each firm was just having crazy ways to do their own performance. Like, no, of course, there were firms that were fraudulent, but then there were firms that just the different way you calculate performance could seriously influence your numbers. So they set up a rule system to where you can't cherry pick accounts. Like, there's clear standards, there's clear calculations, there's clear answers for when something happens, how you handle it, and you get audited. Well, you don't have to be audited, but a lot of the institutional clients like to see you audited, where GIPS firm comes in, double checks your numbers, makes sure you're doing everything correctly, really just so that managers can be compared apples to apples as best as possible.
All right, that makes sense. So that's something that, especially for smaller RAs, again, you probably want to just avoid reporting on investment performance, because that's just too high of a hurdle to overcome. But I guess if you're working with a TAMP or an outsourced investment provider, they may be able to give you some of that information, just depending on the provider. So,
well, I guess that is a good point. So there are TAMPs out there or outsourced investment managers that create content, and a lot of firms will say, great, they reviewed this content, they're compliance people, it's fine for me to use. But what they don't realize is that they're still on the hook for the advertising piece. So as CCO, they're still responsible to make sure that the piece is great. Now, it doesn't mean they have to go through their records and double check everything. But if you have a piece that you're giving out to clients created by another party, and it turns out that it was, I don't know, some issue with it, potentially you could be on the hook for it.
Good point. So if you are working with an outsourced provider, you still got to monitor it. I mean, anything that's going to your clients is still ultimately your responsibility. And I think that's the big mindset shift is that the reason I think it's so much easier to do compliance on the IA side is because you are, as the firm owner, especially if you're a solo, you are the chief compliance officer because someone has to be, so it falls to you. Whereas whenever you're working for a larger firm or you're on the BD side, there are other chief compliance officers that are ultimately on the hook for some of these decisions. And that's why Jeff Rose, had to get everything approved by compliance. So you can hire, if you're a smaller firm, you can hire a compliance consultant like yourself to answer questions. But ultimately, as the firm owner, you're still the CCO and responsible for the compliance of the firm.
And I guess my personality wise is I always like a challenge. I like to learn new things. I like to solve problems. But in the compliance realm, you really want to squash all challenges. Like you want to make it as vanilla as possible.
Yeah, you don't want to pick fights just because those are expensive legal battles if you pick the wrong one.
So like now as a consultant, like there's thousands of problems, but none of them are really mine. So I can give my advice on them. And not have to worry about fixing it unless they ask me to help them out with that. But
fair enough.
The CCO is responsible.
It's funny. Well, as we're kind of wrapping up, I always like to ask guests this one question. I never prepare them for it. So this is how I know if guests have listened to the very end of an episode before. If you could go back to, let's say, the Jim Cullen that's getting into compliance or maybe getting that first job with Franklin Templeton or whatnot. But if you could go back and give yourself one piece of career advice, just one thing that you've learned over the years that you wish you had known then, what do you think that piece of advice would be? Man,
I would say I wouldn't give myself advice at all, just because I don't know how that influenced my decision-making process. And I could end up, I don't know, the Pope or something.
Fair enough.
Down the road. Like, that's dangerous.
All right. Fair enough.
Well, I guess to kind of still answer the question, I do have people come to me that are interested in compliance and they're asking like how to get started. And I always tell them to just get in with an IA firm, like no matter what the position is, as long as it's compliance related, and then they can prove themselves from there. Like you have to start at the very bottom on compliance because there's no other careers that logistically lead into it. Like you just kind of have to start and learn as much as possible.
A lot of boots on the ground learning.
Yeah, don't waste your time with BD compliance. Just go to the IA stuff.
Fair enough. All right, Jim. Well, thanks so much for taking the time to be on today. This is a lot of fun. Who knew we could actually make a compliance podcast recording fun and interesting?
Yeah, I hope so.
Well, thanks again, man.
All right, not a problem.
I hope you were able to learn a lot about compliance for this episode. There is a lot in here that I was not aware of. So it's always awesome to learn a little more about what RIAs need to be doing in order to stay compliant. And just keeping in mind, the core goal is for all things compliant, being sure that you're not taking money from your clients, and everything else is something that we can fix. So remember that you can find the show notes along with resources mentioned in the episode at xyplanningnetwork.com/25. Now, this month's episodes are brought to you by Financial Planners Assistance, providing compliance services to financial planners and other investment advisors since 1982. Financial Planners Assistance is a boutique consulting firm that provides the personalized compliance services firms are looking for. I have personally worked with Financial Planners Assistance since launching my firm back in 2012, and I can't say enough about the awesome service and support I received, including going through an audit by the state of Wisconsin. You can check them out at financialplannersassistance.com. Thanks again for joining me today. We'll see you next time.
You're not alone, and you're not crazy. It's scary starting, building, and growing your own financial planning firm. And that's why we put together a free private community just for you, the Cutting Edge Financial Planner. Go to xyplanningnetwork.com/VIP or text XYPN Radio to 33344 and join a network of thousands ready to change the lives of Gen X and Gen Y clients.